Hello everyone, this is Major General Al Rosende, 63rd Readiness Division Commanding General. And you know, I've been thinking about the COVID-19 and I'm really concerned about our families. The big concern that I have. I know that all of our soldiers, civilians, and contractors are very concerned about their families, and especially those that have children, younger children potentially. And I was thinking back on an experience I had way back in my military career at the beginning of 9/11 and what my son was going over. So I've invited Chaplain Siebold here, who has a background in marriage and family counseling, to see if we can have a discussion about that, see if we can help you out in being able to address some of the issues that might be present. Today, because there was something that was on my mind, and you and I had talked about it in the hallway.
We were talking about your experience in the Catholic school system.
Right, and with my son.
Kids,
my son, yeah.
Kids, yeah.
And when 9/11 hit, my son would basically have a breakdown after he was dropped off in the morning, and he would have to be taken to the principal's office, and he was very emotional. And so after about the third, fourth, or fifth time this happened, the teacher that he had the previous year noticed that. Mm-hmm. And she approached the teacher and she says, I don't know what's going on with him, and you know, he's just having a breakdown, blah blah blah. And and the teacher that had had him the year before said, I know exactly what's going on. So she called me and she says, Mr. Rosende, have you talked to your son about what it means to be in the Army and what's going on with 9/11?
And how long had he been doing this before?
Well, you figure that was in September. That was probably 9/11 was September. This was probably well into October. I mean, this was a month or so after he started to see that things were going to change. I'm sure that he started to see soldiers going places and doing all this stuff, and that's what. But I had not talked to him about it. We had tried to kind of shield him and protect him from that, right? So with what's going on now, what should we do, John?
Well, it's interesting when we're having this conversation. It's interesting to me that he had been going to school, that the teachers had been noticing this odd behavior where he would have a time when he would cry and they'd take him into the principal's office and try to cheer him up and then send him back to class. And then finally the teacher called you up pretty far into this,
right,
and let you know that your son's doing this and that you weren't really aware of it. That's really interesting because what often happens is we get so busy, caught up in what's going on in our lives and what's going on in the world, that sometimes we forget to look down at our children and try to really be aware of how they're experiencing what's going on in the world. We just assume that they just kind of get swept along with it, and they just kind of, you know, go along with whatever the family's doing, and that doesn't really affect them. But it does. And I think one of the I don't know if it's a fear or if it's a uncertainty with us on how to talk to children or how to get children to express how they're feeling, especially the really young children, that we kind of ignore it and we don't approach it. But little children go through times of grief just like adults. They just express it differently. They go through times of being really afraid. If they're more expressive with their fear, their parents know, but some children don't. It depends on their personality. Some people might, just like adults, tend to keep things internally. Some children do the same thing. And so unless you have this conversation with your children, some of them won't necessarily express how they're feeling unless you really sit down with them and give them that time and attention that they need. And I think what's also interesting is sometimes children, and I have met adults as well, that you have to wait. You have to sit with them and sometimes be quiet, and you have to wait for them to speak to you. I know earlier we were having a conversation about a situation where I was working with a child that was about 3 years old, and this child had just lost, she just lost her father in a motorcycle accident. And the mother was concerned that the child wasn't coping well, so she sent the child in to talk with a therapist. And at the time I was doing therapy because I have that marriage and family degree in therapy, and so we sat down with this what we call sand tray, and we began to play in the sand, right? And all we did was play. We sat there and we pulled out some soldiers, some things that she might, associate with her dad. And she began to play in the sand, and I waited. And then she would bring up her dad. This is my dad. My dad was a soldier. And then we talk a little bit about her dad. And then she put a box, and the box resembled a coffin, and she'd be playing with it, and then she'd say, hey, my dad was in a box. And I would just simply say, was that scary? Was that a scary thing? And she'd be like, no, it wasn't scary, But it got to the place where she finally asked the question she needed to ask. She really wanted to know whether her dad was going to come back or not. And I had to say to her, no, he can't come back, right? How did the little child react? She was fine with it. She didn't cry. She didn't have an emotional breakdown like you'd think, She understood.
She appreciated the honesty, I imagine, right?
But it probably took me about an hour to get to that point, right? I had to spend time with her, and I had to play with her at her level. I had to get down on her level and play with her and talk to her in a language that she understood. Right?
If I find it easy to talk to my sons now because they're in their 20s and adults and post-college. Right. But what would be some of the key things that you would suggest to parents that had children? And maybe if you group them by, I don't know how you would group them, elementary school, middle school, high school, how would you group them?
Well, there are age brackets that they group children into, but my advice would be your children, right? Obviously, if your child is really young, that you're going to have to communicate with that child probably in drawings or playing with the child.
Like you described this one with the child.
Just like I described with little army soldiers, or sometimes kids have like doctor, nurse stuff.
Right.
You could always bring that stuff out since it's very prominent on the TV now, and you could sit it out there, and you could use that as a tool to use with your children, and they might start asking about all this medical stuff that's on the TV, and it will open up an avenue for you to begin to discuss what's going on. But you have to really want to sit down and focus on your kids. And the young ones, obviously, they're going to either draw pictures or they're going to use some kind of play, a little doll, or maybe the doll will be lying down, and they'll do what they see on TV, and you might ask them, what does that mean to you?
Right.
Or what do you think's happening here?
I have a question because you probably know me a little bit by now, and you know that I can be impatient.
Yes.
And you didn't have to answer so honestly. But what techniques would you advise for parents that are dealing with young children where they have to demonstrate that patience to let that kind of question come out, like the one that you described with the child where, and then you kind of help lead them into a way, but you have to step back. So how would you help us do that?
Well, when they're really young, you really need to wait, because they will, it takes them a long time to process when they're little, right? So when they're playing, they're processing all of this, right? And they're thinking, and you'll see them play, and then all of a sudden they'll just pop up and ask a question. I had a nephew who was, I don't remember how old, maybe 4 or 5 years old, but he was struggling with the concept of his parents dying, right? So what his dad did with him, and it sounds a little strange, but it helped him. They went walking through a cemetery, one of those really decorative kind of cemeteries, and they're walking through the cemetery, and his son just came out and said, are you going to be in one of these graves someday? And he's like, yep, probably. And he says, is Mom going to be in one of these graves someday? And he said, yes, probably. And then he said, well, will I be here someday? He said, yes, more than likely. He's like, oh, okay.
That was enough?
And they walked through the rest of the cemetery, and that was enough.
Oh.
Sometimes all it takes is for you to be honest. We often want to shelter our children and hide things from them. But that isn't often the best process because they know something's going on.
Right.
They know that they're not going to school. They know that they can't see their friends and play with their friends like they used to. They know they can't go visit grandma and grandpa when maybe they had a visit scheduled.
Right.
They know something's wrong. So by you not really sitting down and sharing with them, and you let them tell you how far they need to go. You don't for some young children, you don't need to spell out the entire process.
Right.
You only go as far as they lead you, as
Right.
far as they feel like they need to go. The older children, you can go much farther with them.
Sure.
But they know something's going on, and to help them out, like your son,
Mm-hmm.
he probably would have coped better if someone had sat down with him and reassured him what was going on, and this is what's going to happen, and given him maybe a timeline. Now, young children, they don't understand time,
Right.
but older children do.
Right.
So if they could get a better perspective on what's going on, and then I think what is really helpful is the parents to kind of lift that burden, because some children carry this.
Yes, they do, don't they?
Even though we don't think they do, they carry it. I remember when I was young, it was the nuclear
Sure.
scare,
Mhm.
right? We were all going to die from a nuclear holocaust, and at school they'd make us hide under our desks, and that was kind of scary for
Sure.
me, right?
Sure.
And I remember a time when I was carrying this. I was carrying it as a child. I was
Sure.
worried for the world. And my father noticed that I was carrying this burden, and he asked me one day, he said, what are you so down and upset? What's so heavy on you? And I shared with him that I was afraid, I was fearful, and I was worried about the world. And he basically said to me, you know what? You let me carry that for you. I'll carry that for you. You can just hand it over to me, and I'll carry it for you. And for some reason, and it's totally illogical, and you think there's no possible way in my adult mind today thinking my dad could actually keep me safe from a nuclear holocaust. But at that point in my life, I knew my dad would protect me. And I was able to lift that burden off my shoulders, hand it to my father, and I went off and played.
Sure.
And I knew I'd be okay.
Oh.
And sometimes I think maybe that's what they need. They need to know that you're going to be there for them.
Roger that. Really important.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Chaplain. Thank you for your time. Something that we want to make sure that we're talking to our soldiers, our civilians, and our contractors, and their families, because I tell you, that's the number one thing that we are all concerned about is our families.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Chaplain.
You're welcome.